There was a time when a conversation about culture was a conversation about books or theatre or paintings or opera. But now culture is everywhere and everything. And as the Minister said, since 2016, Ireland has had its first national culture policy that really aims to put culture at the heart of government. And it aims to put creativity at the heart of every community. So, for example, all of our local authorities now have culture teams. Creativity was once associated almost exclusively with artists, but now creativity and the culture and creative industries are said to be essential to a successful economy. And if you're looking at developing or building a successful career, creativity is now said to be an essential component or skill or attribute. Culture is all pervasive, but how can we plan for something as broad as culture? And that's one of the big questions and big themes that we're going to be thrashing out. What are we actually planning for? Are we talking about artists? Are we talking about entrepreneurs? Are we talking about landscapes, buildings? Are we talking about all of those things? Are all of those things related? And if all of those things are related, how do you account for one without the other? And are you accounting for all of them if you're planning for one? So there's those types of questions that we will be going through. How are we to justify the investment of time and resources, for example? How do you know if your plans are working? Or, for example, does any of this cultural thinking have any real value? So our contributors over the next 2 days, you'll be delighted to hear, are a group of visionaries, experts, and thought leaders. And I'm very excited to hear their ideas, their insights, and their thoughts. Today's first conversation, the first conversation for Riot Sligo, is about how we think about culture and how we can change how we think about it, how the concept of culture in policy terms is changing. It's about what's required for cultural regeneration, what's required for a cultural development mindset, what models, concepts, tools, practices, and values need to be deployed. So you'll be delighted to hear, I'm not going to do any more talking. The last bit of the thing I'm going to do is introduce our wonderful speakers. So first up is Arjo Klammer. Arjo holds the first ever chair of Economics of Art of Culture at Erasmus University in Rotterdam. He is also chair of the Crafts Council of the Netherlands, and Arjo has researched and written extensively on the economics of art and culture, and his most recent work, Doing the Right Thing, develops a value-based approach to the economy. Vaimoana Fadwa Ufi Numitolo is an artist, educator, who was born in Tonga, raised in Hawaii and Utah, and when she's not working internationally on projects, splits her time between New York City and Utah. Vaimoana has directed and written over 20 educational theatre productions, led 24, if not more, community murals around the world in places like Australia, Kenya, Jordan, Palestine, and many locations around the US. Niamh McGowan is Assistant Dean of Research for the Faculty of Arts, Humanities and Social Sciences, and she's a Senior Lecturer in the Department of History at University of Limerick. Her own background is in art and architectural history, and Niamh is a founding director of the award-winning Masters in Festive Arts at the Irish World Academy of Music and Dance, based in UL. And Bernie Butler, Managing Director of Good For You Health Snacks, is also joining us. Bernie is a board member of the International Fund for Ireland, and she was previously chair of the Model Sligo. Mabel Cha, a longtime member of Sligo Gospel Choir, a Cameroonian singer-songwriter, Sligo resident. Mabel sprung to international attention with her hip-hop band BAM, and their EP contains the song Zero to Hero, which is a powerful anthem of self-belief and empowerment. I checked out her LinkedIn profile last week and it said, I adopt, adapt, upskill and grow. I do it again, take a holiday and start all over. So she's currently studying a master's in HR in Queen's University, Belfast. And our last contributor, but certainly not least, Jens Thoms Iversen, is a designer, creative director and artist, and also now a frequent contributor to Irish media. You might have heard him on Morning Ireland yesterday, on RTE and News Talk last week. And Jens works as creative director for the city of Gothenburg in Sweden, where he tries to use rain, a subject that I'm sure we're all in Ireland particularly familiar with, as an asset through the project Rain Gothenburg. And their vision is for Gothenburg to become the best city in the world when it's raining. So as you can see, we have a great bunch of experts, far better informed than I. And one thing that I would encourage you to do, you'll see there is a chat function. If there's anything you'd like to ask, any questions you'd like to pose, any objections you would like to make, feel free to put them into the chat function. And coming up to 12 o'clock, we'll be putting them to our contributors. To kick us off though, and to open riot, I'd like a relatively brief answer. I say relatively brief answer from our contributors to the following questions. First question, what are we talking about when we talk about culture? And why are we focusing on culture at all? What's the value? So why are we talking about culture? And what are we talking about when we talk about culture? Arjo, if I may go to yourself, please, to open us up as our first contributor. The floor is yours.
The question to ask yourself and also others is, what's important to you? When you ask that question, people will talk, first of all, on social things that are important to them, what they share with others. But ultimately, what's most important is what gives meaning to life. And as soon as we're talking and reflecting on what gives meaning to life, we're talking about culture. And then we realize that we are cultural beings above anything else. And that we thrive in meaningful environments that gives a feeling that what we're doing it for adds significance to our life. And that we find through all kinds of things. I call them sense-making activities. It helps to think about culture as a range of sense-making activities in which we engage all the time. Whether we talk about the weather or about politics, about beauty, or about the meaning of life, when we are facing critical moments in our life, that is always about culture. And I will argue, and then I stop, that culture is ultimately the most important quality of a city like Sligo. So that we should focus on culture and all the rest follows.
Thank you, Arjo. Niamh, may I go to yourself?
Gair Margaret, and I think I would echo really what Arjo has been saying. I think culture is fundamentally about living together, and it's about living with the past, and it's about living with the future as well as the contemporary moment. And I think it's about how we live well together and how we make sense of the good and the bad, that happens to us in life individually and collectively. And I think surely that's really, when we think about it, that's at the heart of all government. It's at the heart of all policy making. How can we live well together? So I think, for me, that's very much what we're talking about when we're talking about culture.
Jens.
Yes. So I think also that culture, sometimes for me, it also has a link to the past, as mentioned. And also that's something that we live in the present. And culture is something that's also not tangible. You cannot really put your finger on it sometimes when it comes to a community, maybe. But it's something that we kind of create it together as we live, as we go along. We can look at the history and the past in terms of cultures and traditions and those things. But it's something that's also, we kind of still changing it as we go together. As a collective in a society, we can agree upon certain things. And that's for me very important, and I think important for a society as well, that it's nothing that is determined forever, so to speak. The culture can slowly change as we as humans evolve. That's my short reflection on that.
Thank you, Jens. By Moana.
Hey everyone. First of all, I'm just so happy to be here. Thank you for having me. So yeah, culture, it is our values. It's a set of agreements that a community, that a group of people, that masses of people have agreed upon. I want to point out that these agreements may not work for every single person in that society or in that community or in that mass. And so I'm here standing inside of cultural making, cultural makers. and how important it is to have that come from a place of that everyone is seen, everyone is heard, everyone is gotten, that we all have the power and the voice to create culture, to make culture that can serve each and every one of us, to create the quality of life that people can live in. That's my little 2 cents. Thank you.
Thank you, Vaimoana. Bernie, if I can bring yourself in, please.
Well, I agree entirely with all the other speakers. I certainly believe that culture defines us as a people, a place, and for most, it's a mindset that is influenced, I suppose, by our society in the first instance, our landscape, our heritage, and our legacy. And I think it's all of those things that create the culture that we live in, and that I suppose in so many respects helps us get through our lives, because culture is an integral part to our everyday living.
Thank you very much, Bernie. Mabel?
Yes, I think all the definitions and views of culture by the other speakers I think it's just the embodiment of everything. And for me personally, culture is me individually, and then the next person to me, then my community. And it's just answering the rhetoric. Why did we? Why are we? Why should we? And who are we? Not specifically putting a fixed answer, but keeping it open to be able to grow and incorporate others, and also be able to share whatever those values are that define us or that are us.
Thank you very much. Vaimoana, may I go back to something you said, where you said it's really a set of agreements that they're agreed upon, and that you are looking to around culture and cultural makers. Can I ask then, how can culture and creativity be the driving force for reimagining a town, for example, like Sligo? And how do you go about doing that?
I mean, yeah, first of all, creativity, creation, first and foremost, culture, right, is a creation, and all of us are creators. And I really want to put the creativity in the context of really creating a quality of life that serves everyone, if that's not clear what I said before. And that's why I'm so interested in being in this conversation with all of you. You know, and I'm coming from indigenous land here, Utah land here in Utah, also known as Dene land. And so there is such an indigenous culture here in the United States that has totally been shut down, shut off. You know, hello, talk about occupation, talk about ethnic cleansing here in our country. And why, just to bring it back to the creativity, is that each and every one has the power to create something inside of a culture that does not serve them. And that is where my community murals come from. That's why I think the arts are so important inside of the context of no matter what the circumstances are, no matter what's there right now, is that we can use our creativity to create a world that we all want to live in together, and a world that works for each and every one of us. I hope that answers your question.
It certainly did. Arjo, I'd like to bring you in on that from your perspective, Arjo, and the work that you have both done on the academic and research and collaboration around that, but also then on your practical experience. If we are trying to reimagine a town, how can the culture and creativity become the driving force of that? How does that actually work, and what from your experience?
See, we are here in this conversation what we call culturalists, people who find culture important and put that first. But that's not reality. In most towns, I'm an economist. Economists have a dominating discussion, and they resemble the cynics in the famous Oscar Wilde saying, the cynics who see the price of everything and the value of nothing. And they accuse the culturalists, the ones we are looking at now, that they see the value of everything and the price of nothing. Now, the battle that I am waging right now is against this sort of instrumentalist way of thinking that always puts the financial figures first. I see it also in Sligo. If I go to the advertisements about Sligo, it's always about tourism and about the products and the services that Sligo has to offer, the attractions, the place to stay. And of course, there is mention of the past, about its religion, about its music venues, its festivals, mainly to advance what I call a transaction model. That there is money to be generated. Now, when I advocate a paradigm shift, to shift the focus on the quantities to the focus on qualities. And many of us here already said it very nicely. Also Mabel, by emphasizing who are we? You said it very nicely. Who are we? What do we share? That is what culture is about. And I'm going to introduce a few concepts that I think will be helpful also for policymakers. Instead of thinking about markets and organizations, it becomes, in the scholarly community now, is a shared concept to talk now, first of all, about the commons. So what are the commons in a town like Sligo? What do we share? Apart from, of course, the beaches and the market square, but what do we have in common? And then the next step is, and that's where we are now, to think about the common practices. Which practices do we share? And that the life of the town, and several of us already have alluded to that, is determined by the quality of the common practices. The research we do right now is, and I work with a Korean researcher, and we sort of using big data, trying to figure out what the quality of the common practices are. And to come to the conclusion, strong towns have high quality common practices. That means that all kinds of people are talking, playing, making things together and creating the culture of the town. So the emphasis of my contribution today will be on the quality of the common practices and what policy can do about it, but what also the people can do about it.
Before I move off you, Arjo, would you mind giving us some examples when you talk about those common practices? What is it that you're talking about? You talked about talking, playing, and making, but when you reflect on those common practices, what are the types of things you mean?
Now, to give an example from my hometown, to be honest, I am unbelievably sort of what you guys are doing. I mean, I really compliment you for organizing this, and I wish we could do it in my town, which is, by the way, a contribution to a common practice in the town, to bring all these people together to talk about your town. It's great. But to give an example of my own town, it is the market. We have twice a week a market. And that means that people from farmers and other people selling their ware, and I go to that market. It is not just to buy stuff, but to meet people, to feel part of what we share. And so the market becomes actually a common practice. I contribute by going, but so do many others. If we are not going, the marketplace would not thrive. I actually myself, I have been governor for my town. I was helping to create an old cinema into a sort of food hall, which is a tremendous success. Of course, not in this time, but as soon as Corona over, that will come to life again. And what that means, it becomes like a magnet for all kinds of activities. So that place is filled with all kinds of activities that make it a shared common practice that adds quality to my town. And so you guys in Sligo have also all kinds of activities that add quality to the town. So my suggestion is, instead of focusing first of all on all the products and services you have to offer, is to focus instead on the quality of the common practices that make the town.
Thank you, Arya. Bernie, from your perspective as living and working in Sligo, how does what Arya talks about, how does that sound? Is that practical? What are your ideas, and what are the types of things around those common practices, but driving and using culture and creativity as the driving force to reimagine Sligo?
I think it's essential. Sorry. Thank you. I think it's essential from our perspective as a business in Sligo, and employing people who are coming from different cultures and embracing Sligo and coming to live here and creating a place of culture that they can connect with. And I do think that Sligo as a town, as the epicenter of the culture of the whole place of Sligo, unfortunately hasn't delivered that concept of enabling people to be part of a society. From our perspective, we Arya spoke there about common practice, and I suppose I pull that into the cultural values and the social values, and what we are trying and hoping to do is to integrate that in such a way that it creates a place to live, visit, and work that people are proud of, that is inclusive. And I think the most important thing, and whether it is the arts we're talking about in the context of creating a culture space, culture is innate in business. It doesn't have to be necessarily just for the arts. It has to be innate in business, in industry, in college, in every aspect of life. And from our perspective, the guiding principles would be integrity, authenticity, openness, diversity. So I think while we talk about common practice, I think it happens across all aspects of living. And yes, we too, I'm delighted to say, have our wonderful markets, and we absolutely love them. And they're places where we come and we talk. Regrettably, of course, we live in a different world in the last 12 months, but for the most part, that they are the spaces that we're trying to create. We have art centres, but it's a much deeper conversation in the context of Sligo and reimagining Sligo and rebooting Sligo and unlocking that conversation about who we are, how we connect with people. And I'm not sure I've quite answered the question, but I do think it's essential, and I do think it's innate in the entire context of the life we live in Sligo, the place we call Sligo. And I think it's something we definitely need to work on: the values, the ideals, the engagement. And as I said, I'm sure we'll speak more about that throughout the day, but yes, I agree entirely.
Thank you, Bernie. Niamh, may I bring yourself into this, please? Because it's linked a little bit to what Bernie talked about, unlocking the potential, unlocking ourselves, unlocking our conversations. But traditionally, cultural thinking was kind of kept over in the library or the arts office. What does cultural planning look like in terms of community and economic development, and from your experience and perspective on that?
Thanks a million. And I suppose I would just start by saying that, I think Sligo is fantastic in many ways. And I also think that libraries and arts offices are fantastic too, and they do brilliant work. And I think, it's not about displacing those really essential functions that have incredibly dedicated people working very hard around this. But I suppose I might think a little bit about using culture actually as a tool, as opposed to something that is a product, that can be a foundation stone in terms of a reimagining or a planning forward in terms of thinking about the future of somewhere like Sligo, and I suppose thinking about as culture as a tool for working in that process, and actually as a tool that enables power to be shared in a very important way. And I suppose I would just ask people to think typically into how does planning take place? Where does it take place? What does it look like? When I think of it anyway, I usually think about documents on a shelf. I think about people in a boardroom. I think about quite a small group of people really, making decisions, often with the best will in the world, with real passion and heart in terms of what they're thinking about, but perhaps not feeling comfortable or not knowing how to open out that conversation to be inclusive of many more people. And I really do think as well that policy and strategy, it's only as valuable, they're only as good as people will listen to them. There is nothing more annoying and nothing more pointless than a beautiful document on a shelf that gathers dust and that nobody really feels connected to in many ways. And I suppose when I go back then to this idea about thinking of cultural practices actually as a tool, I would see them as being something that, as cultural practices, as inherently being connected to story, to allowing people to tell their stories of what has worked for them, what has been meaningful for them, what helped them in a time of need, what made them feel included, and when did they feel not included as well. What were the lived experiences around that? And sometimes you can't get at that, in a half an hour sitting around a boardroom or a half day sitting around a boardroom. I think sometimes there are ways of working that might involve storytelling, that might involve walking together, that might involve songwriting, that might involve visualizing. And I think those are ways in which culture can be very powerful in terms of actually creating that space of shared authority that can be very valuable as a place to start from, kind of upsetting the apple cart a little bit in terms of who's at the table. And I would also say, I think that culture allows us to think about different perspectives, like, for instance, are we able to bring in the views of children, who maybe are not going to feel 100% comfortable sitting around a boardroom, but maybe could contribute to the cultural planning and the cultural reimagining of their futures in ways through cultural practices. And just finally, I would say that I think culture allows us to be really flexible in this. It can allow us to sit together and imagine radical possibilities for what the future might look like. We might be able to sit together and reimagine 17 different Sligos, and think through those collaboratively together. And that's incredibly powerful, as a mode of engaging, as a mode of thinking. So I think that, that kind of flexibility, that radical potential, that inclusive potential, I would say are really exciting ways of thinking about culture as a tool, as well, for that kind of work.
Niamh, may I ask you just a very brief supplementary question on that? Because Arjo has talked about the idea of common practices. You have talked about common practices and cultural practices, and you have talked about getting everybody together. But what strikes me is that doable in practice, where given that people are so diverse and the contributions would be so diverse, that you actually achieving commonality that everybody can buy into?
I think it's interesting. So first of all, I think the word practice is important. It's not ever going to be finished. You're going to be doing it all the time. Second of all, nobody is ever going to agree all the time, and that's probably very important. You need to have, there's always going to be points of conflict and points of tension. And I think that's okay. I think it's important to understand that there is no perfect cultural policy. There's no perfect Reimagining Sligo document. What you can have, though, is a document where people can feel trust in the transparency of the process and trust that it's being made available to them in a genuine way. So I think that's really what you're looking for in terms of, can that actually happen? I think it can, but I don't think it's easy. And I think that there's, there's a lot of ongoing conversations. There's a lot of ongoing trust building. And as long as, and not everybody would want to take part in that conversation today, but they might next year. So I think it's about keeping open those spaces and kind of keeping it as kind of an ongoing workshop rather than a project. That's something that can be kind of finished.
Yeah, so it's a process and an ongoing process rather than an acute focused thing. Jens, may I bring you in on this, because children and engaging children was certainly mentioned, and I know that you have done great work in Gothenburg around RAIN and incorporating playgrounds. But aside from that, or including that, would you mind be able to describe RAIN Gothenburg, that whole vision, that idea, and how did you approach it, addressing some of the things that we may have heard about from our colleagues around common practices, and also using this as a way of driving forward development and community development?
Yeah. So the thing is with RAIN Gothenburg, it's not only when it is raining, it's also about when it's not raining. And it's all about building a better city, really. But we just take a standpoint from that it's actually quite a rainy city, and then kind of looking at it, how can we use that as an asset when we talk about all these different things within a city? And just one thing I would like to mention just to start off with is that very important, I think, that cultures and different cultures will also be that we are not agreeing upon everything. I think that's important to remember. And also remember that that is the normal phase, when we're not agreeing on everything. So that means we have to just accept that, and also find, okay, in how many ways can we work with that, and just accepting that. So I'm a designer, I'm educated as a designer, so I use the design method in most things that I do, no matter if it's a small project or if it's a huge project where we work with integration in the city or whatever it is. So this means that we're really thinking about what problem are we really trying to solve? And I usually take the example with litter bins. You know, litter bins in cities. And I think that's a good example because most people can relate to that. So there is no city in the world, not a single city, not Sligo, not Gothenburg, no New York, no city wants litter bins. So the thing is that, what's the problem we're really trying to solve? What is it that we really want? Is clean streets, clean parks, clean places. So the first question should be, in how many ways can we solve that? In how many ways can we create clean streets, for example? Well, one way is maybe to consume less, to create less waste, perhaps. That's one way of doing it. And then we can start, listing different kinds, and we're not allowed to say litter bin. Of course, litter bin is a good way of solving that problem, or at least a part of it in the end. So taking that thinking with us when we work with, for example, playgrounds for kids, then we can think, okay, it's not only a playground. What problem are we really trying to solve? We need children. Is important. It's something that's important for all children, is to go out and play. So what does that mean if you live in a city like, for example, Gothenburg, where it rains 40% of the year, and you have like October, November, December, January, February is quite dark and wet and cold and windy. I can think that people in Sligo might relate to that as well. So if that is a fact, either you ignore it or you work with it, you change it to an opportunity. So that means creating places, and then you start talking to children, and you quickly realize it's not the children that's the problem. They usually go out to play when it's raining. It's us parents that kind of goes, oh no, it's raining outside, let's go indoors. So we need to think different in that sense. And the thing with playgrounds for children is just one example. And of course, ask them and you can see that children like to play with water. So why not use that? It falls for free on our heads. So what more can we use the rain for, different than that? And also, I would just like to say that we talk about culture and creativity and those things. And it's so important to create cities that are open-minded. And it's easy to say in a way, but I believe in that it should also come from within the municipalities and the cities and the decision makers. They should have artists, designers, dancers, musicians, whatever, inside the city. Not only, taking decisions, saying, okay, let's do what we always have done like this, and then in the end we add an artist to make something fun, or create an event or a festival or something. That's really good, but I think that the future for changing cities lies within having, how do you say, creative people. And creativity is seeing the unseen in a way, trying the things we don't know so much about, allowing ourselves to make mistakes, and learn from that and move forward. And I think for us in Gothenburg and in Rain Gothenburg, we use the rain as a kind of both excuse and asset to try out ideas. Because due to the climate change, we need to deal with it. We know there will be more rain, it will be more droughts. Yeah, I think I paused. I don't know even what the question was, so I'm totally lost.
Well, it was a fabulous answer. So, gosh,
Yeah.
when God knows how great you'll be when you remember the question. But that was absolutely brilliant, Jens. Because I'd like to bring Mabel in on that, because Mabel, there has been, obviously Jens has talked about the buy-in, the vision, the being able to use rain in very different ways. When you listen to this, and you listen to Niamh and Arjo as well, talking about common practices and that approach of collaboration, as a resident in Sligo and also as somebody who's extraordinarily creative yourself, what's your reaction? How do you think, is it doable?
Thank you, Owen. Yes, I think it is doable if everything, first of all, starts with identification. Identify who would voluntarily identify as part of this people, part of this place. What is the common ground? Do I identify as somebody from Sligo? Once I can voluntarily on my own identify, then it means I want to grow. It means I want to contribute to make this place better for me and for my community. So participating in common practices would then come easier for me, but then it's not everybody. Because I have identified and would probably have one or two people I could influence, the idea now is motivating, so I could stand like the leader, being able to hit me. If I stay motivated, I'll be able to motivate any other person that listens to me to join in to all the other, into different common practices in the town. And if I stay motivated as well, I know Bernie was talking about being able to create a place where people can visit, people can want to live in, people can invest, people can thrive, and that's what's going to bring the culture of the town, the identity, the core values of the town alive. And I think, yes, if you get like the heads to be able to talk to their different communities who can communicate, by motivating one person, you get to motivate a whole fleet of different communities. And yeah, and also I think it's Niamh that was talking about culture, using culture as a tool, creating policy and strategy. But then, yeah, she was right. She said with the best policies and strategies in place, without the people to carry these out, all of that would be in vain, because yeah, culture would eat strategy any day for breakfast. So it is the people. What I would think is identify the head. For me, is identify the people that can speak to the different units in the whole, motivate them, understand what makes their different groups tick, and bring them in and include them at every stage. Jens was just saying, don't include the artist at the end. Bring the artist, don't make me feel like you've made all the decisions and you're just handing it down to me. I want to be there from the beginning, making all these decisions, telling you how it's going to affect me, how it's going to affect my own little unit in the whole. And that alone gives a sense of belonging and being included at all the stages. Yeah. So
Brilliant, Mabel. Jens, can I bring you in on that?
Yes, I think it's getting. I think for me, been working now 4 years with RAIN as a starting point, is that working with different cultures, different people, no matter if it's children, business-related people, whatever organizations. The thing with RAIN, I think, is something we all love and hate, or love to hate, or we have different aspects of that. We interviewed in Gothenburg different people that came from different parts of the world to see what were their experience of rain. Because in some parts, of course, there is very little rain, and when it starts to rain, it's celebration and it's really important. And some parts you get too much rain, so it's a global issue. But it's also very democratic. It rains on all of us, no matter what. So it's something we can find as a, how do you say, common thing. We can all, no matter your culture, we can all kind of relate to the same thing. And that's quite nice, I think, with rain in that sense. Okay, what does that mean? What does it mean to be human in a city, from different aspects? So I just wanted to mention that it's good. I think that the rain is totally neutral in that sense. It doesn't care who it falls upon.
Thank you, Jens. Vaimoana, may I bring you in on this? You've spoken previously about community being the most important thing to you. And Mabel was speaking about really making people feel part of it, motivating them, engaging them. From your experience, what have you observed working and perhaps not working, and mistakes that have been made that could be avoided in the future?
Yeah, I would love to. First of all, this conversation is so great. I would love to just respond to what everyone shared and put it all together to answer your question. Okay, so first and foremost, I love that Jens said that, talked about rain, right? And I totally want to uplift that culture, right, is a relationship with our climate, right? Our land, our nature, right? You know, as y'all know, I'm from an island, I was born in an island. That culture is very specific to the ocean, right? To that land, to the warmth of that place. And so I really uplift that. And uplifting that culture is a response and way of life to really include everyone's responses. I'm saying this inside of the engagement of, again, what you just said, of like, of course it's so normal and it's so needed to have a diversity of voices that are on this whole spectrum in culture. And I think that's what just makes it more rich. That said, what Mabel was saying as a response to of artists being a part of the whole process, not just as an entertainment or as at the end, right? But that brings me back to the responsibility of artists and our leadership, how art are also leaders, and how that is in our society. We're not just on the sidelines or outsiders necessarily, like so needed as artists, as leaders, and what leadership provides for each and every one of us. That said, first and foremost, the whole process of the creative process. Can everyone hear me? My internet is kind of weird.
We're good.
Sorry. Can everyone hear me and see me?
Yes, yeah. Well, Vaimoana, while you're doing that,
okay, great.
May I bring you in?
So yeah, I really want to emphasize how important it is to make mistakes, to fail. Can you hear me?
Yeah. But you were saying, Vaimoana, the importance to fail, to challenge. Niamh, I'm going to go to yourself if I may, because I think when we're discussing cultural practices, there seems to be maybe an assumption that all cultural practices are good. How do we challenge bad cultural practices? You know, those that promote our special identity, yet at times probably exclude others.
That's an interesting point. And I just want to,
1, 2, 3.
I think her point about the freedom to fail is really important. I think sometimes, I'm not sure, Vaimoana, if you want to come back in to finish that point before I pick up, or Owen, how
No, we
like
keep going, Niamh, on that for the time being. Yes, please.
Perfect.
Thanks.
But I certainly think that's a really important point that Vaimoana was raising about that. I suppose I don't know that I would think about cultural practices in terms of good or bad. What I would think about is, I suppose, open and closed planning and management practices and policies. And I think Dave O'Brien, whose work I would really recommend, who's a lecturer in the area of critical culture policy studies in the UK, and he has just published with 2 colleagues a great book called Culture is Bad for You, which is, you know, a good provocative title in many ways, but really what he's looking at are the ways in which unexamined practices that can be very well-meaning can actually have the unintended impact of reinforcing boundaries. If we do what we always do and assume that our cultural practices are open and assume that everybody is welcome, I think we can really be in danger of assuming too much and not seeing the blocks and the barriers and the roadblocks that are there. I always think of it in relation to when I'm thinking about this. I often think about you know, a cultural institute or a gallery or something that has a big sign over the door saying "free, all welcome." Why does everybody not go in then when it says "free, all welcome"? Because there are so many other messages that are being sent about who is welcome there, about who is valuable there, about what kind of body belongs there, who sees themselves in that. Do you know how to respond to the work? Do I know when to clap or when not to clap? All of these learned cultural behaviours that are part of, you know, how we signal class identity, how we signal social identity, how we signal socioeconomic status, and we can't get away from that. And I think, you know, there has been, and Eleanor Belfiore is another wonderful scholar on this, who talks about, you know, the fact that in our rush to prove that culture is valuable and that we should fund it and that we should be investing in this, we can risk overemphasizing that and not maybe looking at some of those more awkward questions around, well, you know, are we having critical enough conversations with ourselves about what we're doing, about what we're promoting as culturally valuable? Have we kind of fallen back into something of a Victorian model of culture as improving people? And if so, who are the people that we're implicitly considering in need of improvement? And what is the culture that we're kind of setting up as that culture that people should be engaging with? And these are just some of these difficult, awkward ideas that can be very easily bedded in to a culture of cultural policies and practices. And I think that's why I really like this idea of taking away a sense of kind of blame culture, but allowing that kind of workshop environment where you constantly have fresh water flowing into these conversations and to these planning practices. So that's a long and complicated answer, Owen, I'm sorry, but I suppose I'd get away from that idea about good or bad and maybe get us into that sense of, you know, is there fresh water flowing into that mill, you know, enough to keep what we're doing relevant, to keep what we're doing active, to keep what we're doing, to keep it genuinely culturally valuable. And I think culturally valuable is not necessarily just happy positivity all the time. You know, it can also be really difficult, hard, awkward conversations, but we have to have them. And culture is often the space where you're able to have them. So that's enough, I think, from me on those points.
Oh, that's fabulous. Thank you. Arjo, may I bring you in on this, please? Just from your perspective, both on the policy side, but that element of the development of the common practices, the it being an iterative process and that there is that importance for review and progression. What was your own take on that, and what's your own view and from your perspective?
I was not planning to do this, but I do think that we are emphasizing here in this discussion the importance of culture. And many of us are emphasizing the importance of all kinds of qualities of the culture, like the diversity of the voices and the fresh water that comes in, and that we don't want to sort of be too sort of keen on distinguishing good and bad practices. But we are at the moment at a cultural crossroads in my country, and I'm sure also in Ireland and certainly in the United States, where there is, you could say, a sort of cultural battle going on, and where sort of certain values are prevailing that many of us have a hard time with, sort of racism, sexism, nationalism, and that. So there seems to be brewing something. And I think, therefore, if we are sort of the culturalist, we have to face that. And we have to also understand what's going on. And I hesitate to do it because it has a negative connotation, but I do play with the notion of civilization. And I do play with the idea that there is progress, that we are seeking progress also in culture. And that we're understanding our past, but we also understand that we are making progress. For example, the way we are not discriminating, treating other people with respect, even though there are differences. And let me point to one practice I want to get this into. Why do I like to go to Ireland? Why do I just discussed with my wife, we want to have a second honeymoon, and we want to go, our first honeymoon was in Ireland, and the second one has to be in Ireland again. Why is that? Now, she likes to walk, so it is your landscape. That's clearly attractive. But for me, there's another reason. Can you guess what? Which common practice does allure people like me? Do you know that?
I'm always wary of answering rhetorical questions,
right.
Because I'll tend to get it horrifically wrong. But I'll try and say, is it our friendly nature and our warmth?
Yeah, that's part of it. But I think you are a great conversationalist. When I go to a pub and wherever, I've not been in Sligo, but in Cork or Dublin, or I have the most fantastic conversations. You guys are unbelievable conversationalists. Apparently that's a practice, including the practice of sharing music with each other. That you have also like no other people I know of. You get together, you make music together, which is for me from the outside coming in. And that what I mean actually is a strong common practice that I would consider part of your civilization, is a strength. So if I would go into your town as a researcher, I would like to see what the common practices are and what the qualities of they are. I also look for the threats, and like if you guys have still local newspapers, which is great. My town lost them. It's very important to have local news, that people share news. So I myself would always stress the importance of that. But there's also, and I have no clue how that works in your town, but the social media can be adding quality, but also distracting quality. And we see that social media is also a threat, ripping people apart, separating them. So I would be curious how that works in Sligo, in the community of Sligo. So there are all kinds of ways that I would be more critical. I think that culture is not always good because it can also take a negative turn. You can lose it. You can lose this common practice of conversations in the pub, right? You can lose that. If people become too opposite to each other, then you lose that practice. So it is one strength of your community to have that practice. And the question is there enough to warrant its furthering, its progress, that there is more of it rather than less?
Well, can I ask you to just maybe develop on a couple of things there a little bit? How do you then, or who decides good and bad? and how do you avoid the bad and accentuate the good? Is that through policy? How is that done, and what would be your guidance on that? Does policy need to be put in place, for example?
Well, good politics addresses issues like this, right? If you have a strong political climate, that means that people talk about this. I would like to feed that by, and we have mentioned that already, Bernie also addressed that, that I'm clear, I need to be clear about the values that prevail in Sligo. What do people consider important? And instead of just talking about culture and social values, I would like to name them. If it is true that for the people of Sligo, engaging in conversation is important, in meaningful conversations about politics, about sports, about culture, you name it, about literature, about poetry. Guys, you have a poetic history, that there is poetry, that people find it important. Then you can also monitor it. I'm advocating a sort of evaluation system where you make it explicit, you name these values, and you monitor in a way how it is developing, what is happening. Are the values, the awareness of the values increasing, or is it decreasing? If it's decreasing, if people, for example, don't care that much about poetry anymore, the kids don't read it anymore, then the question is, are we going to do something about it? You can always do something about it. And then you can intervene, you can have projects to restore the conversation about poetry or the making of poetry, just to one example. And so then you can monitor it, and of course not that the policymakers then can sort of institute a program. You have to do it also with many others, teachers and parents and whatever, to generate a sort of poetry project to restore or revive the live poetry. Now, and that is, so I would like to, if I were focused on Sligo, want to make that explicit, articulate the values, and then evaluate them.
Thank you, Arjo. I'm going to come back to you on a couple of those in a moment, if I may. But Mabel, I'll go to yourself. When you listen particularly to what Arjo has spoken about around the naming of what the values are, and naming of the practices, and naming what we care about, how does that sound to you as a Sligo resident, as somebody who is contributing to the cultural fabric of Sligo?
Yes, I say it's important to have a good political and legal climate with, being able to name what the values are, to identify and name them so that it can be worked on. What I would say is, okay, the political climate in Sligo, for example, is it, I mean, how inclusive? It would be something I personally would not have gotten into. Is it because I didn't get the opportunity to are there activities that would only involve or include people that are politically minded, or are policy minded and are interested in things like that? Or is it, are they open to the community, where you will know what's happening, where the policymakers of the community are, and what they're doing, and so you as just a member of the community can walk in? I don't know about that. That's naming them. And let's say legal, okay, the legal structure, it would not just be for Sligo, it would be national. There would be legal, there'll be policies that are put in place. How many people, do people from all the communities actually get involved in making legal policies as well? Naming them, I don't think so. But then again, we don't want a situation of what, a cultural dysentery. There must be a value that is held on to, so that whatever is coming in, even though we're trying to encourage inclusivity, we don't want it to run wild. Like we don't want it to run wild. Like Ari was saying, social media is good, but then it could also come with a lot of its own ills, separating people. By trying to incorporate the culture of the new social media world, we may lose some of the values. So while holding on to, I understand that while holding on to the strength and the core of the cultural values of Sligo, it is important to set a limit then. Just set a limit to how much can be taken in, and this is it, just, and have it open that this is how much will be taken in, but your voice will be included at every stage. I don't know, am I answering your question on?
Yes, you are indeed. And Bernie, I'd love to bring your perspective in on this, having heard Mabel, but also then having heard Ario and Niamh around that element of the common practices and how that might work, and what are the good and what are the bad. What's your perspective?
Well, I think certainly in the last 12 months, we have seen a huge shift. Perspectives have changed, values have changed. What people want out of life has changed. And I think digitalization is part of our world today. And we should use it to establish and to reach the communities that we are trying to serve, that to ask them what they think of our culture, what they would like to see. Because while we talk about creating, developing culture, we can only do that when we develop ourselves and our organizational structure, our culture. And I think today, if you were to ask the millennials who've returned to Sligo, the people who've come home and said, this is where we want to be, we want to relocate, we want to work from home, we want to be part of our society, we want to make it better, we want to be part of making it better. And how do we do that? And it goes beyond Sligo. It's a better world. It's the climate agenda. It's the green energy. It's all of those things wrapped up and integrated with the wonderful culture that we have in this place. So when we talk about political engagement, I personally think that it's political will. It's part of it. They have an agenda. They have a role to play. But it must, at all times, be a community-driven, society-driven agenda. It must always, but always, reach the people who are going to make this happen, make it work. Sligo town as a town to visit has incredible assets. There's no question about it. As I said, I'm under the spell of Sligo for the amount of assets everywhere I turn. But Sligo itself has underperformed and needs to be that place, that centre point for all diversity, for multicultural, for visiting, for creating that environment that people feel safe, welcome, included. And I think the younger people of today, especially, and have that view about Sligo, understand that it could be a creative place, it could be a place where people want to visit. And I do think we have a real opportunity today, and more than ever, to ask the question, have the conversation at grassroots levels as much as it is at leadership, that will create leaders, because we need our leaders in every walk of this journey. And I think in creating the roadmap, for me, that's the most important thing, is to reach out to people and ask the question. We have data at our fingertips today. We can quite easily survey and ask people and sit around the table when we've asked them and see, are we all on the same page? And I think that to me is the starting point.
Thank you, Bernie. Jens, may I bring you in on that?
Yes, I think one good benefit or power, so to speak, or advantage that cultural and creative practices do have is actually in being able to visualize, to show. And I think for any city, the more permissive you are to allow people to show, to do things and test things. So, for example, doing things and using the public space is exactly that. It's for the public. and it's a space that we can use. And I think that doing things, whatever it is, events, projects out in the public space, not that it's permanent, but actually a test to get feedback from the people, then you will get feedback, no matter what you do from the public. And that is, there you show very quickly, you can see the differences, but also moving forward by allowing, okay, this time we did this, next time we did that, but it's an open city that allows different things. For example, with poetry that Arjo mentioned, that's something that we because we did that in Gothenburg now, we've done manhole lid poetry. So we choose one poet every year that get the fantastic opportunity to do poetry on manhole lids. And it's casted in the iron. So we do 50 of them each year, and they are placed all over the city, random places. So as mentioned earlier, that if you have on a art museum for free, everyone is welcome. Not everyone go there. We all know that. But the public space has no rules in that sense. It's open for everyone. So all of a sudden, when you walk, no matter if it is in a suburb or in the city center or wherever it is, all of a sudden you stumble upon some poetry made by a poet from today. And also that trying out different solutions in a city before making them. Usually you have this, method in cities that some people are sitting around a table discussing what's best, and they do some kind of surveys asking the citizens, but those comments are rarely really looked at to be honest. I think, of course, they kind of flavor it, but it's decision made in a room, and then prepared drawings are made, and you get a installation in the city, and you go, here you go, hope you like it, and then you move on. Instead of turning it around and doing tests that are not permanent from the start, but good enough to get feedback and be out there and get comments, meeting people and listening to them, and they can, give you instant feedback over a longer period of time, maybe a month, maybe depending on the project, of course, can be longer or shorter time. And then you go back, and then you work, and then you go out and before you make it permanent, so to speak. I think one good example is what they've done quite a lot in London at the South Bank, where they use this. They try different things. They are not really permanent, but they try it out, and if it's successful, they can be there. They are more and more permanent in that sense. So I just want to say that being a city where you allow tests, things to happen in the public space, where different people can try their ideas and you get feedback. For example, the poetry that we make on manhole lids, of course there were some comments saying, what the hell are you using tax money for that shit? We hate poetry, that's really shit. That's fine. You can never ever do something in a city where everyone likes it. That's not the point. So you do that, and then you do another project and another project, and I usually ask the negative people. I usually ask them, okay, so if you could decide, what would you want to do? And then we can try that next time. You can be part. Just engage yourself. So yeah.
Thank you, Jens. That's our quota of bad language for the morning, so we might avoid any more. Thank you very much. Niamh, I'm going to go to yourself, because I think first and foremost, you seem to be engaged and interested in what Jens said, but also I'm interested, if we're trying to reimagine a town, it then requires some sort of leadership from local government. How do you create a creative municipal government? What does it look like? How do you do that? Niamh, did you hear that? Sorry.
Sorry, Owen, my internet froze slightly. I wasn't sure if that question was directed at me. Okay, but I heard the question, and I suppose I really wanted to respond to what Bernie was saying, and also what Van Rana was saying earlier in terms of allowing things to fail, allowing take the burden of everything having to be a big success, a big political success all the time away, because that's not, like, culture doesn't operate like that. If it's really meaningful for people, it's going to change. Things will work, things won't work. You're going to be taking risks. And I always think, when we're thinking about culture, we kind of talk about culture, but culture is never really about culture. It's about life and death and sadness and birth and, love, and it's about birth, and it's about the stuff of life. And that's what you're dealing with. You're dealing with the messiness of full humanity. And I think first and foremost, good local government around that needs to bear that in mind. When you're planning for culture, what you're doing is you're saying to people, come in here and talk about this with me, think about this with me. And that's really powerful. You're asking people to be vulnerable, and you're asking people to take a risk, and you're asking them to engage in a trusting experience in a communal way. So my, I suppose, first kind of instinct when thinking about that is, take that seriously, take what it's about seriously first and foremost. We hear a lot about smart cities nowadays, and I'd love to see kind cities, like gentle cities. Let's see what that looks like. Hold somebody in a cultural experience who is grieving. Hold somebody in a cultural experience who has, has a child living overseas that they haven't seen for 3 years. And also, I would say, just in terms of that kind of testing mentality, which I think is so valuable, and that comes into that kind of permission to fail. In the kind of briefing document that you gave us, there was it was like, well, what's the difference between building a road and building, building a cultural infrastructure? And in a way, the great thing about building a cultural infrastructure is that you can change. It's a lot easier to change than a road or a roundabout, and that's a great benefit. But the needs of communities change all the time as well. What a community like Sligo or any community needed 15 months ago is completely different to what it needs now. And that kind of responsiveness and that capacity to be flexible and to listen to the community. Like, for me, the best kind of cultural policy and management strategy is all about listening. And that's why I love this idea of conversation comes up again, because ultimately what you should be doing if you're planning for culture is you should be going out and listening to as many people as possible, listening to what they need, listening to what's hurting the community, where is joy needed, where is a salve needed. These are these kinds of things, that's the stuff of life that you're working with and working for.
And Niamh, can I jump in? Sorry, just to ask you a supplementary on that. You've talked about it, and we've heard it already, the comfort in failing, the comfort in testing. But is that doable within a county council municipal structure where no doubt there are performance management systems assessing people on the success of their project, on the impact that they've made, on key performance indicators? Is that doable, and what's the way of achieving that?
It is, of course. You just set genuine flexibility as one of your key performance indicators, and you actually maybe look at, well, what's the evaluation metric? Do you actually maybe allow that community to be part of that evaluation in a genuine way? So we have to change our sense of what looks like success in terms of culture. It's not a whole load of people, clapping in a room necessarily. It's not a whole load of, it's not a big tourist spend. It's not bed nights. We have to kind of think really carefully about what we think about as culture. It might be somebody having an argument, actually. It might be opening up a conversation. Jens was talking about the fact that public space is open to everybody. I would respectfully kind of disagree with that, in that for some people, the experience of public space is fraught. Success might be, for example, opening up public space in a way that people might, maybe some people who felt uncomfortable or at risk in that environment, maybe feel more comfortable. And how do I evaluate that? That brings us into the whole question about how we actually think about evaluation. And that brings us back to conversation, and it brings us back to storytelling. So, I suppose I would say, of course, all of these things are possible within a county council. And I would say county councils, city scale, county council scale. It's the perfect scale to work with this. It's the perfect kind of conversation level way of planning. I think that most of the exciting things that we're seeing in terms of cultural development or even kind of climate action and things like that are happening at that regional level rather than that national level, because actually change happens at the level of a conversation. So I would say, if you're worried about key performance indicators, go and have a look at those key performance indicators. They can't be a stick that's beating something so important. Actually, you have to go back and you have to look at those again and make them work for you.
Thank you very much, Niamh. Moana, may I bring you in? Listening to Niamh, and from your own experience of the work that you have done in communities around the world, who needs to be on board for an effective reimagining to take place and to take hold?
Well, first and foremost, I just have to say that culture, I'm here to say that empowering the community is where it's at. There's so much value already in the community. I truly believe that everything we want, it's already with us in each community. There's so much value, strength, importance, love, there's just so much wealth, right? On so many levels in community, and that anything that needs to be done or created, it's within community. And so I see that inside of listening for these I answer your question with questions, meaning like it's just so important to be curiously engaged constantly and consistently with answering these questions. And who needs to be at the table? Each and every, seriously. It really is. I truly believe inside of community that everyone matters and everything matters. And each and every, especially the people that disagree with me, that do not look like me, do not talk like me, do not speak the language as me, they are in my community, and that is, as you can hear, I'm just so excited because there's just so much to say, and I'm looking at my time frame, and then Jens already used the curse words, so I can't use curse words. So that's, yeah. So, and also the importance of the conversation, and yeah, who is having the conversation, like today, right? Whose voice matters over another, whose voice is valued. I think those are questions that can be answered time and time again. And I give it to the people of Sligo to answer those questions. And definitely who needs to be at the table. First and foremost, all the people who don't have a table, who sit on the floor. Culturally, we sit on the floor, we eat on the floor, we gather on the floor, who creates these metaphors to eat, who even creates this, who creates these narratives. And so all to say, my point is how important that all the value and strength is in community already, and it's in Sligo. The power is there, all of that.
Thank you, Moana. Aryo, may I bring you in on that? When you're listening to the conversation that has just gone, what's your reaction? Are you agreeing? Are you disagreeing?
I agree with a lot. I also think, because I'm used to these discussions, and I'm also, I know the passion that also speaks through what people say. But I also have been a governor of my local town, and what happens when you bring that passion to the governor's table, and it quickly dissipates, right? It dissolves because of other interests suddenly take over. And then these voices get sort of are named to be romantic or unrealistic or emotional, and people like are very good in putting this down. And that is the atmosphere that you're working with when you are governing in a bureaucratic system that a city government also is. And I myself actively have tried to change that. And to just name a few concrete things that I have done and that you can do as a governor. I would bring people like Jens and Mabel to the table. It's interesting, I worked actually with people like Jens to also design certain processes, which to the civil servants was a revelation. They never, they don't know people like Jens, they don't know how to handle that, and it's interesting what he brings about. So, and as a governor, you stand behind that, all right? You have to back him up, because it will be, there will be difficult moments. And I would also have love Mabel to the table and have her sort of talk and address and say what's important to her. That's one. So bring people like them to the table. Two is, and we mentioned that already, but that's what I did, is organizing conversations. Inviting people from neighborhoods, streets, different types of communities to the table. And I was impressed actually by how eager people were to do so, especially also when I made my commitment as a governor. And I was also impressed what people were willing to share and bring to the table. One advice, though, is never ask people what they want. Don't ask people what they need, but ask people what's important to them. You get a very different discussion when you start from that, because then you talk about values. Then become people stop being children, who want more, but they become adults. They suddenly take responsibility, because then they will emphasize that these qualities are important. That's important that you share, and that you stand not against each other, that you take people who are different seriously. Almost all people find that important. And having articulate that already changed the tone of the conversation. Because once you have established what's important to you, and it's remarkable, I also do a Utopia exercise and make people fantasize about what is the ideal neighborhood and what's the ideal city, which is a fantastic exercise. I let them draw them. And it always turns out that they find things that the commonalities is important, the shared practices are important, that always the climate is important, the greens are important, the music is important, the sacred is important. I mean, that's what all comes down on that paper. And once you have that, it's part of the awareness, which I think is critical. And this conference is also about raising awareness. Once you make that concrete, then you can sort of agree on projects, things you're going to do to improve what we all and get close to what we find important. And then that's also, Niam also emphasized that, and I agree totally with her, you also have to evaluate. Because the evaluation makes people, and that's not the numbers, not the quantities, but the qualities. So we agreed that we bring about, we have this poetry project, and then you evaluate and see, and I agree with you, it doesn't have to be perfect, and you don't have to seek these applause and these numbers, but usually will appreciate the process. And if people make a serious effort, then you will discover in evaluation that that is appreciated. And once you together realize that a project like that is important and it works, that gives you then the incentive to do more like that. So it's all about awareness, by sharing, creating organizations, and as a governor, you can make a huge difference, is my experience. But you need people like Jens and Mabel to bring that about, to change also, to prevent people to go back to the financial data. We know too much about that, but we know too little about the culture. So we have to increase our knowledge, our awareness of these cultural common practices that we are talking about here.
Thank you, Arjo. May I remind the people in attendance today that we will be opening it up for questions in about 15 or so minutes. So if there are questions that you have based on what you have heard, feel free to send them on into us, and we would be delighted, and I'll be delighted to ask our contributors those questions. Also to remind you of the hashtag Riot Sligo. May I go to yourself, Mabel? Just listening to Arjo and his discussions around it, his own experience as a governor, there is a type of leadership though required around this. Can I ask from your perspective as somebody living in Sligo, what does leadership look like for you, or what leadership would you like to see, and who gets to lead? You may be on mute.
Oh, sorry. Can you hear me now?
I can indeed. Thanks very much.
I was just saying, one thing we definitely all agree on is culture is not looking for success. And I think leadership as well, if as a human being you realize that we all come with flaws and all, if we're not looking for success, but for someone that would be able to communicate our shared values and goals, then that's the person that's the person I am looking to be a leader. A leader does not have to identify with everybody individually. That would never happen. So as long as they can communicate between in every society, you would find there are units, the family unit, the neighborhood, the street, the community, from different migrant backgrounds. There are always small units. If there is somebody, for me, the leader then is that person that could communicate the values of this unit fairly with all the other units and bring them together for the betterment of the whole town, like Sligo, for example. To me, that's what I'll be looking for in someone who's a leader, not the perfect leader. Because once you start thinking the perfect leader, then the perfect leader will not get the job done of representing you. Sometimes it's conflict, sometimes it's strife, but you just want somebody who's going to totally represent your values, and somebody with whom you can disagree, but yet agree that they can represent you. So for me, that's what leadership would look like.
Thank you very much, Bernie. There was something Mabel mentioned, that we can all agree that culture does not necessarily equal success, or that it doesn't have to necessarily be that. How did that land with you as a business owner, and then obviously somebody who is interested in Sligo? How does that resonate, and would you agree? Would you disagree?
I think like everything, that you have to have failures along the way. You become better. You learn and you grow. And I absolutely agree with Mabel. What is the perfect leader? Everyone has strengths. And I was thinking, as she was speaking, of an example of good leadership in our local village here in Ross's Point, where a group of people came together and have done incredible work in terms of growing the community, creating a nice atmosphere. And I think they've done it, as I said, of their own will. And it was easily, or it appears to be easily done. They resonate with the community. So I think it's vitally important we have leadership at every level to come to the table. I think from my perspective as well, how do we tell our story? How do we unravel that leadership quality and that in our community? Because we know it's there, but how do we make the conversation? How do we touch a chord with people in communities that brings them to our table, brings them to the table at the right time? Because we have what we call a continuous improvement culture in our business. And the way we engage is with our people. So we talk to them, we ask them what they think. It's a two-way street. it's about that learning, how we as leaders are doing as much as they are doing as participants in that journey. So I think going forward for our town and our county and our own communities, we do need leaders, and because they're central, and if they can resonate with their communities, they will add more value to this conversation than, you know, the big picture. They will make the difference in this being success and us getting onto we're not going to deliver everything overnight, but in starting the conversation.
Thank you, Bernie. Vaimoana, may I go to yourself, please? Because something has struck me that there seems to be a theme developing that engagement with people, hearing different voices, is critical ultimately to cultural development and regeneration. And that motivation, that engagement has to be in place to ensure, I suppose, or we have to have that to ensure citizen engagement. Can I get a sense from you, what are the types of ways you can engage those voices who don't typically have their voices heard, or who don't typically engage with the more traditional or established services?
Definitely. In answering your question, that's why the arts is just so important. And I'm answering your question, Bernie, right? And how the arts, how artists are leaders, how we can empower and train and develop artists as leaders. That is just so important. So important to have that with, such as what you were just saying, or as a political leader, as a governor, right? There needs to be artists as leaders in each and every community. You know, I came as an artist in residence to Dublin to work with the community in Ballymun, you know, and what the vehicle, it was hip hop. It was hip hop and it was singing Shanos, you know, hence hip hop was Shanos created Hypnos, right? These young men and these young women, they had everyone, first of all, everyone has something to say, right? And culture is language, right? The arts is a language. These young people, they know what is needed and wanted, and they know what's important to them, and how they articulated, how they created that was in hip hop. One of the most like talented rappers I've ever met in my life, actually, right? And the work, the theater work that I do, the community work that I do is all about sharing their stories, owning their public spaces, right? Let's talk about public spaces, putting their portraits of themselves visually and their words out in public spaces, saying, hey, I may not own my house, I may not own this building, I may not own, you know, my rights in this education system, but I'm going to own this space in a public space. Welcome to my neighborhood. Welcome to my community. The arts is so important in engaging people, most importantly, connecting people, and creating really are all about like, hey, what is your story? How can I empower you, first of all, to share your story where you may feel like you don't belong. You don't even belong in all layers of society, right? And really empowering and giving spaces to these voices, especially in institutions. I'm putting quotes in institutions, but that our homes, each and every person's home is a cultural institution. And hello, even the street is a cultural institution. And if we could all uplift those places, those spaces, and the spaces in between too. This isn't romantic. This isn't like, oh, hey, fun and games. But I do want to emphasize bringing play to everything in terms of in terms of like, yes, let's play with these ideas. Let's figure out. That's the whole process of creativity. Not looking for the perfect thing, but really playing and figuring out, okay, what works? What is this? Oh, okay. That failed. All right, let's do it again. But there's so, and I know it's all over the world, but there's so many programs that people have created, and that's why I'm just so interested in Sligo. These programs of like theater, you know, I do narrative theater, personal narrative theater, where it's all about like, hey, where did your family come from? Well, how did your parents meet? Hey, how do you identify? I think they're so important, and I could go on because I'm just so passionate about it. Thank you.
Thank you, Vaimoana. Niamh, may I go to yourself, please? Vaimoana touched on the street and the taking of the street, and I've heard you speak previously where, particularly around festivals, there was a discussion around streets being a commercial space, but then a space for people and taking them as part of the festival. But I guess when we're reimagining a place, whether it's Sligo or elsewhere, it certainly disrupts those types of traditional views, whether it's that of ownership or power, of funding, and that leads to resistance of change. How can that be overcome? And how do you navigate that to ensure whether it is a successful festival, but also more of a long-term process like we have been discussing?
Thanks. I've just been kind of punching the air while Vaimoana has been speaking, because I'm just so inspired by by what she's saying, and the other speakers as well. Yeah, I always think of public space as a muscle, you know, and it is a muscle which needs to be kind of exercised and worked out in order to not fall back into maybe the way it had been previously. And I think that the kind of interactions that we have with public space that actually really meaningfully look at who is represented, who feels safe, who has power, who is allowed to go where. And that's actually where I think listening to people's stories really comes in, because I might look at a street and say, that looks lovely, I'd feel very happy walking down that street. I mightn't have experienced racial aggression on that street, for example. So I need to listen, first of all. That comes fundamentally to the core of what I'm talking about, listening to what different experiences that people have had, and then thinking into that experience and say, well, how do I create an exercise for this public space so that it actually changes, so that people feel actually different in it. And festival is it's kind of a shot in the arm for that, you know, because it completely turns everything on its head in a liminal time period, and kind of completely kind of changes the environment of that space for a period of time. But, you know, what's more important to me really than the festive experience itself is, you know, the legacies and the kind of echoes of that festival experience, in terms of, you know, well, you know, did it just kind of act as that kind of feast of fools, and, you know, where the king is uncrowned for a day, or does it have a more lasting impact in terms of who is seen in public space, who feels safe in public space, who is allowed to express themselves in public space? And I always think as well, you know, when we think about festival culture, very often it allows us to see who is held up and who isn't, you know, who is in the middle of the parade walking down the street and who's running around the edges causing trouble. You know, maybe they're causing trouble because they want to be in the middle of the street. You know, that's something, you know, to think about, I think, when you're actually looking and thinking about those dynamics. But I just wanted to say, I suppose, two things, picking up on something that Bernie was saying about leadership and about voluntary leadership. We have incredible voluntary leaders in arts and culture across this country, and they are an amazing resource to be supported and held up and celebrated more and more and more. I think it's a huge resource that we have. And then the other thing was about, we keep talking about the table, that we need to bring people to the table, and just kind of picking up on something Vaimoana was saying, I think we need to kind of rethink that as a picnic table and start bringing the table around the place a little bit more than expecting everybody to come into this magical table where all the decisions are made.
Thank you, Niamh. Ario, I'm going to go to the questions from our attendees in a moment. But I have to admit, there is something that has been gnawing away at me, and it is probably a very thought-provoking comment that Mabel made about culture not really equaling success. And perhaps this is just illustrative of my own personality. I like to know, did things work or things not? How do you evaluate the success of something? How do we evaluate if the thing is working? What are the approaches that you would suggest?
Try just typing an answer. I'm not sure I can send it. Yeah, I have developed a quality evaluator, and I've applied it in several settings, and that works quite well. The quality evaluator is important to identify what we call the stakeholders, people who have a stake in a particular project. And that is inclusive because you can identify all kinds of stakeholders. And you ask first the various people what's important to them. You try to get on the table what qualities do they care about of their neighborhood, what's important. And then you have your project or whatever you do. And then at the end, you ask two questions, basically. How do you experience? What is your experience? What have you noticed, observed, felt? And that's what you ask. And then you ask again what's important to them. And impact is, as we articulated, is that people change that what is important to them. So we have to be talking about poetry. If they say first, well, I don't care anymore, I think it's really not for me. And then you have a project, and later at the end of the project, say, no, it's actually pretty important. Yeah, this kind of that's his impact. You change people's mind, and so that people become aware, and that is. So you focus really on what people find important and how that contrasts with their experiences, and that turns out to work very well. And it's just for government very helpful, because then they can also see where the projects actually worked. Did that change people's minds? It's for the culture makers, by the way, also a challenge, because they can overflow with passion and commitment and so on. But is it working? I work a lot with culture makers, and they often don't pay very much attention to that. What's happening with people? They have this performance, they made this music or whatever, they performed this dance, and what is that doing? My experience is that they are so focused on getting the performance that they forget about what happens afterwards. Whereas maybe that's the most important part of the whole event. And what happened? Same for this conference, by the way. You put a lot of effort in preparing, but the effect of this conference is what happens after. What kind of conversations are we having? What is changing? Are people suddenly find culture indeed more important than they did before? That's what I would like to know.
Brilliant, Dario. Thank you very much. Jens, may I bring yourself in, please? From your experience, both in Gothenburg and elsewhere, what are the kind of skills that are needed in local councils to foster and support the kind of shared interests in a place that we have been advocating this morning?
Yeah, I would say, because as a designer, I think very closely to what Arjo said, that first asking questions like what's the need, what is important to people. And then also, of course, it's easy to sit here and say that, I mean, that's something that I work with, and I see my job as a creative director working for in this Rein Gothenburg thing is actually to try and push the, how do you say, open up the city, the way we think, because we can all agree here, we all agree upon most things. So we all say, we need to empower the community, for example. That's really important. Then the first question is, okay, in how many ways can we do that? We need to be very concrete in finding the methods of actually doing these things. We all agree upon different cultures are important. We all have, it's important that everyone feel that they can express themselves. So the first question is, when you work in a city, for example, and you have actually responsibility for shaping a city, I think that's very important to understand and remember. Everyone that works in a city, also, of course, the people who live there, we all have a responsibility. But I think, as we talked about earlier, good or bad leaders and all those things, there is not a leader. It's the better is if there is a group of people that maybe has the job to kind of organize how we think. So once we know the needs when we ask the people what they need or what is important to them, then we ask the question, okay, in how many ways can we solve that? And you try to be as concrete as possible. And you say, you have a workshop and you say, okay, let's find 3 to 5 different ways to actually execute that. How can we do that? And then you choose one of them, you have to choose, or maybe combine a couple of them. This could be one way of actually empowering our people in this community, for example. And then you try that. You have to try, because no one has ever sit in a room and figured out the best solution that worked perfectly and then, work that out. It could work for a certain moment in time, of course, but keep on trying. You learn and then you progress and then you move on. In that way, you also create an open society where it's okay to try things. Then people will learn who lives in that city. Okay, now they tried this. Next time it's something else, and let's stay, on top of this. So that is, I think, to try to be in a way narrowing all these good ideas down and try to be concrete. Okay, what do we do with it, and how do we actually achieve these very good things that we all agree upon? And knowing that there will be different ideas. So we have one time we have to, okay, let's go for this. We try this method this time. Next time we try it slightly different. So that I believe in, trying, testing in the public space, getting feedback, and then in that kind of way develop.
Superb, Jens. That's fascinating. Bernie, may I go to yourself? A question that has come in, and I think it would fit from where your vantage point in Sligo. What is required to develop a more sustainable approach to cultural and creative thinking and planning in Sligo?
More questions. Well, I suppose in the first instance, we've heard the speakers, and if I was to take away a couple of points before I get on to how we do it in Sligo, it is what is important to us, and every opinion matters. And in terms of sustainability and having a story to tell and unlocking the cultural assets that we have. I mean, they're truly in abundance. We've heritage, we've mythology, we have, beaches. We have it all in the context of the natural assets and the context of arts and culture, the Eight Brothers. I mean, from our perspective, in terms of building a sustainable cultural society, it is about doing all of what we've just discussed. It is about engagement. It is about consensus and about, people who have that opinion, who understand the value of arts and culture, not just in the social, but in the economic context of our town and our county. So I think from our perspective, it's integral to the whole development of Sligo and the success of Sligo. And it's in the hands of the people of Sligo to make that happen. As I said, I'm not sure that quite answers the question, but I think ultimately cultural development in our town will sustain us if it's integrated into a strategic framework for Sligo into the future. So we have one voice, one vision, and we share that.
Thank you very much, Bernie. Mabel, can I bring you in, please? And I'll be going to all of our participants in a little while to get some takeaways, as we are about 10 minutes from close. But Mabel, from your perspective, what are the types of things, whether it's around culture, that could make Sligo a more inclusive place?
First of all, being able to communicate with the individual in Sligo. I know we were talking about the table and who has to be on the table and bring everybody on the table. If you're very lucky, you only have 80 years. And if if you're to be governor like Arjo, you probably, some of the 80 years you have to rule people. And if you have to talk to everybody in every household, you probably would never achieve very much. Hence, representatives, hence leaders from a household, from a neighborhood, from all of that. And what I'm thinking is to make Sligo more culturally inclusive. Yeah. So that's it. Everyone's voice. We keep culture really agile. Like we keep taking in and updating while still holding onto the core values of what we want to see as a whole in Sligo, and opening the doors, being able to communicate, being able to reach out to every individual in Sligo to realize that if we all are working towards the good of the town as a whole, then there is no way anybody coming from outside either to visit or leave or work, there is no way somebody coming from outside will not be able to fit in. Because for a culture of that nature to be built, Sligo is quite cool. Sligo is so diverse and is doing so much. I just love the city. It's amazing. It's small enough for everybody's voice to be heard. So I think platforms, when Ario started, he said we need to create practices, like we need to create the practices of inclusions, things like that. Once we have more of these platforms, we already have markets, we have the beaches, we have all these places, but get everybody in there and realize that people would come with their different beliefs, and it's all going to be beautiful as long as we all agree that this is a Sligo beach and we want it to be kept this way for the benefit of everybody. Get to the individual through the leaders in their communities.
Thank you, Mabel. Ariel, can I pose this question to you? It has a fabulous phrase within it, so I wanted to put it to you, which is there a case to be made for local authorities, instead of attempting to lead on centralized cultural planning, to instead pursue a policy of enlightened disinterest, essentially get out of the way of cultural creators and producers?
Yeah, I like that. I also responded to that already, because I saw myself more as a facilitator than as a leader. If you, as a governor, facilitate the conversation, so to say, and you can really do that, bringing people together, people find it interesting, but then have people talk, share their narratives, their stories. We also talked about it. And by the way, the Irish are great at that. I love to listen to the stories that people tell. But if you create ways that people share them, it's unbelievable what happens. But let me give you a concrete example. We had a difficult neighborhood, a tough neighborhood. Lots of addiction problems with debts, people being at home, not at work. It was very hard to enter and get people to enter. And the way it worked there is, and it may be strange, but it worked great, is to start with dog shit. Because the area was, I noticed when I walked around, it was covered with dog shit and no one bothered about it. And I found out that when you brought the dog owners together and people who were really bothered by all this because the kids couldn't play out, that was a conversation starter. And once you got started about that and people found it important to take care of that, and the dog owners became aware of it, one thing led to the other. 2 months later, we had a meeting with the people in the neighborhood discussing all kinds of issues. And then before you know it, they had a sort of urban farming project. And from one thing comes the other. But you find you need to have a hook to start the conversation with. Now, I found that interesting and to see, and that gave me actually the conviction how much is possible if you only are creative and keep an open mind and make use of what's going on in the neighborhood, and then all kinds of things are possible, was my experience.
Mario, thank you very much for that. What I would like to do now for our conversationalists, our participants, is to invite you to give some recommendations and some takeaways for all of the people logging on now and for those who'll be watching back later on. Niamh, if I may go to yourself, when you've reflected on this conversation and when you're thinking about the things that people could take from this, what are the recommendations? What are your key takeaways for us today?
It's been a really interesting conversation, and I've learned an awful lot. I think that you know, in terms of the key takeaways, I suppose I always think about the image of the frisbee as being a helpful one in this regard, and to imagine everybody sitting around trying to hold on to the edges of the frisbee. Everybody has the frisbee in common, and they might have different things, that the different values, different ways in which someone might be a business owner, somebody might be a street artist, you know, somebody might be a parent, somebody might be an educator, somebody might be a tourism, you know, operator, somebody might be a poet. So allow difference to exist, but at least have the frisbee in common, even if it gets uncomfortable, even if you might argue, even if you might squash up against each other a little bit. Allow yourselves to all be holding on to that core thing that you hold in common, that you agree upon. As Mabel was saying, like, you know what that is and keep that at the center. And then it's okay to have disagreements. It's okay not to be perfect. It's okay to try something, have it work a bit, maybe go back to the drawing table, see how it could be made better. But keep coming back to that, keep celebrating that, keep lifting that up. Don't lose sight of what that core thing that you have in common is, even if it gets uncomfortable around the frisbee at times.
Thank you, Niamh. Superb. Bernie, may I go to yourself, please? What takeaways, recommendations do you have?
Well, again, it is most definitely what is important to us, and establishing that. I think it's also very much about embracing openness, new opinions, new ideas, and not being afraid to fail. And as I say, with risk, there is reward. So to bear that in mind. And just to say that it's been fantastic having conversations with people, professionals and experts in this space. And I've taken much more away from this whole conversation, which I hope to share with people into the future.
Superb. Thanks, Bernie. Mabel, may I go to yourself, please?
For me, it's what I'm taking away is about the creating common practices with barriers to entry that are not put in place to sieve out a group of people or to sieve out a particular culture. So whatever the barriers of entry are, they are in place to empower the core value of whatever the practice is, but not to eliminate people. So a culture of inclusivity. So that's what my big takeaway would be.
Thank you, Mabel. Vaimoana.
My response also is inside of just what Bernie beautifully said, that we are one Sligo. And I just want to break that down in that is not an ideal, that it actually is a reality for us, for all of us, not only in Sligo, but as human beings on this planet. You know, I was in Palestine, and one of the statements that Palestinians say is, my existence is in resistance. And in a community activist, an abolitionist, an educator, a teacher, I actually want to share that our existence, it actually is found in another. How I exist is because it is found in another. And so I want to create that context is, you know, inside of inclusivity, inside of celebrating one another, is a context of like, I cannot exist if you don't exist. And so of course I'm going to live in this world, in this community of empowering you, because you being empowered has me being empowered, has my family being empowered. Of course I'm going to be interested and curiously engaged in all the kids who live in Ballymun, all the kids who live in Cameroon, in Harlem, in Brooklyn, because their existence, that's where I find my existence. We are totally connected. I acknowledge all of you for this conversation. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Moana. Thank you very, very much. Jens, any final comments and recommendations?
Yeah, comments maybe. So I think do. So if I would say anything to any city, like for now we're talking about Sligo, start doing, just do, try things. And also just imagine, no matter what your position is, imagine that, I come to Sligo and I visit your town for a week. And then when I go away, maybe I take the train somewhere and you sit behind me and you hear what I'm saying to my friend. What do you want me to say when I leave Sligo? What do you want me to say? Do you want me to say, oh, I went to Sligo and it was such a nice open city. They had all these things happening and I felt really welcome no matter who I am. And it was really, what do you want me to say? And that's not so hard to imagine. And then ask yourself, what do I need to do to make that happen? What do I, as a citizen or a leader or whatever, what do I need to do to try to make that happen? And or at least make it possible to happen. That's my my last comment.
Thank you, Jens. And Dario?
Now, I wish that we had people like Moana in Hilversum, in the town where, I mean, it's unbelievable what kind of energy and enthusiasm you bring. And I think if we talk about how organize this conversation, people like you, but also the others here are very much needed to bring in energy. Because that's what I think we conclude is important to raise awareness of culture and what it ever stands for. And I think that's what this whole conversation is about, raising awareness, and to also understand that it can be concretely applied in cities like Sligo, but cities all over the world. That you can, by organizing the conversation, bringing people together, asking people what's important, and then you will discover that people will be actively sort of pursuing what we think adding quality to our common practices.
Thank you, Arjo. Well, thank you all very much for your contributions. And on behalf of all of the people watching in, can I thank Arjo? Can I thank Moana, Niamh, Jens, Bernie, and Mabel for their wonderful contributions and giving up their time. We're hugely appreciative of it. And the insights and thoughts and ideas have been really fascinating. And I hope that the people of Sligo appreciate them, and I know that they do. So Goramila Mahagwiv Galer Asa Ukt Shin.